A 15-year-old boy rushing to class spotted a crying child locked inside a car under the blazing sun. Without hesitation, he broke the window, but what happened next left the bystanders in shock. The morning in Phoenix was scorching hot, the city already suffocating under the summer heat. The city seemed frozen in its slow rhythm, but 15-year-old Thomas didn't have a single second to spare. He was running along the uneven sidewalks, his backpack swinging behind him, nearly hitting a trash can and almost colliding with a newspaper stand. Thomas's mind raced, searching for excuses he could give his history teacher, Evan Williams, but he knew no explanation would work. The teacher was strict about punctuality, and 3 tardies in a row meant a week of school duty. Thomas's lungs burned, his sneakers slapped against the pavement loudly, and sweat dripped down his forehead. He muttered under his breath, "Just a little further, Tom. Just a couple more blocks." The world around him blurred. Familiar stores and faces became nothing more than a vague backdrop. All that mattered was getting to school on time. But then a faint sound caught his attention. It was muffled, almost out of place on a quiet morning. Thomas skidded to a stop, his sneakers sliding slightly on the sidewalk. The sound came again. It was crying. Thomas turned toward a nearly empty parking lot by a nearby store. The sound grew louder as he approached an old car parked under the scorching morning sun. Squinting against the glare, he froze. Inside the car, on the back seat, was a baby. Thomas saw that the child was strapped into a car seat. The baby's face was red and shiny with sweat, and their tiny hands weakly pressed against the window, letting out intermittent cries. Thomas's stomach twisted into a knot. "Hey!" he shouted, scanning the parking lot. "Whose car is this?" His voice echoed off the nearby buildings, but no one answered. Thomas ran up to the car and yanked on the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The car was locked. "No, no, not this," Thomas muttered, running around the car and checking every door. The baby's cries were growing weaker, and Thomas's panic intensified with each passing second. The heat radiating from the car was unbearable even from the outside. He couldn't imagine what the baby inside must have been feeling. The baby's head tilted slightly to the side, and its tiny chest rose and fell with labored breaths. A terrible thought struck Thomas. This baby might not have much time. "Hang on, little one," he said, his voice trembling. He glanced around, searching for something, anything that could help. His eyes landed on a large rock near the edge of the sidewalk. Without hesitation, Thomas grabbed the rock. "I'm so sorry for this," he whispered, lifting the rock over his head. With all his strength, he smashed it into the car's rear window. The glass shattered with a loud crash, scattering shards across the seat and the ground. A wave of hot air blasted Thomas as he reached through the broken window to unlock the door. Swinging it open, he carefully unfastened the car seat straps and lifted the baby into his arms. The child was burning to the touch, its tiny body alarmingly limp. Thomas clutched the baby to his chest, his heart pounding wildly. "You're going to be okay," he whispered, unsure if he was trying to comfort the baby or himself. The baby's body felt impossibly fragile, and the faint movement of its chest only deepened Thomas's fear. He stepped away from the car, scanning the area for help, but the parking lot was deserted. The world around him seemed frozen, motionless, except for the faint breathing of the baby and the loud thumping of Thomas's own heart. The nearest clinic was 3 blocks away, a distance Thomas walked every day between school and home. Clutching the baby tightly, Thomas started to run. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and the heat pressed down on him like a physical weight. His arms ached from holding the baby, but he didn't dare slow down. The baby let out a soft moan, its cries now barely audible. "Hold on," Thomas exhaled, his voice shaking with desperation. The streets of Phoenix blurred past him. A flower shop, a coffee house, the newspaper stand he'd nearly crashed into earlier. People turned to stare, some shouting something, but Thomas didn't stop. All his focus was on the clinic, the bright beacon of hope at the end of the street. When he finally saw the white facade of the building, a surge of energy coursed through him. Ignoring the burning in his lungs, he forced his legs to move faster. The clinic doors were just ahead, but to Thomas they felt impossibly far. "We're almost there," he muttered, though doubt gnawed at him as the baby's breathing grew fainter. Thomas burst into the clinic, his sneakers sliding on the smooth floor as the glass doors swished closed behind him. "Help! Someone! Help!" he shouted, his voice trembling with panic. The small waiting room, filled with patients flipping through old magazines, turned to him in unison, startled by the sight of the breathless boy clutching the baby. The nurse behind the reception desk froze, her hands suspended midair as she reached for a folder. Her eyes widened when she saw Thomas holding the baby, its face bright red and body limp. Thomas approached the desk, breathing heavily. I found this baby in a car," he gasped. "I don't know if he's breathing or not. Please, help!" The nurse's professionalism kicked in like second nature. "Call Elizabeth Blackwell immediately," she instructed an assistant who darted through the double doors leading to the emergency department. The nurse came around the desk, her hands steady though her face betrayed her tension. "Where are his parents?" she asked cautiously. "I don't know," Thomas exhaled, struggling to hold back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I saw him locked in a car under the blazing sun. He could barely breathe, and I just couldn't leave him there." "Give me the baby," she said softly but firmly. Thomas hesitated for a moment. He had held the baby so tightly, protected him so fiercely, that letting go felt impossible. But the calm authority in her voice reassured him. With trembling hands, he handed the baby over. The nurse took the baby carefully, holding him with practiced precision, and quickly disappeared through the emergency department doors. Thomas was left standing in the middle of the waiting room, his knees buckling as he leaned against the desk, trying to catch his breath. Whispers began to fill the air around him. "What happened?" an elderly woman asked a man beside her. "Is the baby going to be okay?" a little boy asked, tugging at his mother's sleeve. But Thomas didn't hear any of it. All he could hear was the echo of the baby's faint cries, which now seemed to have stopped altogether, though he couldn't be sure. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Thomas stood motionless. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, the only sound in the suffocating silence. His hands still tingled from where he had held the baby, and he stared at them as if searching for answers to the question tormenting him. Had he done enough? A gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "Are you okay, son?" Thomas looked up to see a woman with a kind face and a medical uniform. Her badge read Elizabeth Blackwell. Her expression carried the experience and compassion of someone who had faced many crises but never lost her humanity. "I don't know," Thomas murmured, his voice barely audible. I acted on instinct." His voice cracked, and he gestured weakly toward the doors where the nurse had disappeared. Dr. Blackwell nodded, her face a mix of concern and reassurance. "You did the right thing," she said. "You brought him here, and that's what matters most. But is he going to be okay?" Thomas barely managed to ask, his voice almost a whisper. Dr. Blackwell's expression softened, but she didn't give him the definitive answer he desperately wanted. "We're doing everything we can. He's in good hands now." Thomas's legs finally gave out, and he collapsed into one of the plastic chairs lining the wall. The adrenaline that had fueled him drained away, leaving behind exhaustion and a slight dizziness. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. Images of the past few minutes replayed in his mind. The baby's cries, the unbearable heat inside the car, the feeling of the fragile body in his arms. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of the fear and horror that had consumed him. The sound of quick footsteps made him look up. The same nurse returned, her face showing the fatigue of someone who had been working under immense pressure. She walked straight toward him, and Thomas's heart raced. "The baby is stable," she said, her voice warm but cautious. "It was close, but you got here in time. That made all the difference." Thomas exhaled sharply, his body relaxing as though a heavy weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly lifted. Relief washed over him, but with it came a flood of new questions. "Is he really going to be okay?" he asked. "Did you find his parents?" The nurse raised a hand gently to stop him. "The baby is still weak. He'll need monitoring, but he's no longer in life-threatening danger. We've contacted the police, and they'll be here soon. They'll need to speak with you." "The police?" Thomas blinked. The thought of explaining himself hadn't even crossed his mind. All his focus had been on saving the baby. Yes, the nurse nodded. We need to figure out how this happened and where the baby's parents are. Thomas nodded slowly, the seriousness of the situation dawning on him. Where were you, and how did you find the baby? Tom took a deep breath and tried to recount everything as clearly as possible. The faint cries, the locked car, the suffocating heat, and the moment he smashed the window and carried the baby to the clinic. His voice faltered as he relived the moment, but he pressed on. Diamond listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. You mentioned that no one else was in the parking lot? He clarified. That's right, Tom said. I looked around and called out, but no one came. Diamond nodded, closing his notebook. Thank you, Tom. What you did was incredibly brave. Smashing the window was risky, but you might have saved that baby's life. You don't see that kind of courage every day. Tom hunched his shoulders, unsure how to respond to the praise. I just couldn't leave him there, he murmured. Dr. Blackwell, who had been standing quietly against the wall, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder. I think that's enough for now, she said to the officer. Tom has been through a lot. Diamond nodded as he stood. Of course. Thank you, Tom. We'll contact your parents if we need anything else. After the officer left, Dr. Blackwell sat back down across from Tom. You're handling this better than most adults would, she said warmly, but it's okay if you feel overwhelmed. What you did is a lot to process. Tom stared at his hands, which still trembled slightly. What happens now, he asked. With the baby, I mean. Dr. Blackwell folded her hands thoughtfully. For now, he'll stay here until we're sure he's fully recovered. After that, it's up to the police. If they find the parents, they'll have questions to answer. If not, she paused, then Child Protective Services might get involved. Protective Services? Tom repeated, unfamiliar with the term. Dr. Blackwell nodded. If the parents can't be found or aren't able to care for the baby, he might be placed with a foster family. It's not an easy process, but it's there to ensure kids are safe. Tom's chest tightened at the thought of the baby, so small and vulnerable, ending up with strangers. Do you think they just forgot him? He asked, though he didn't believe it himself. Dr. Blackwell sighed heavily. It's possible. People make mistakes, even terrible ones. But there's also a chance it wasn't an accident. That's for the investigation to determine. Tom leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had acted on instinct, but now he was beginning to grasp the gravity of what he had uncovered. Sensing his turmoil, Dr. Blackwell placed her hand over his. You did the right thing, Tom. Don't forget that. Before he could respond, a nurse appeared at the door. Doctor, she said in a calm but urgent tone, the baby's condition has stabilized. His vitals are improving. Dr. Blackwell's shoulders visibly relaxed. Thank you, she said, standing up. Tom watched her leave, feeling a warmth of relief melt the cold knot of fear in his chest. The baby was safe. For now. Hours later, police returned to the clinic. Their presence sparked whispers among staff and visitors. Tom stayed in the break room, too anxious to go outside. He sat with his head in his hands, weighed down by the day's events. When the door finally opened, Tom looked up, expecting to see an officer. Instead, his mother rushed in, her face a mix of fear and worry. Thomas, she exclaimed, hurrying to him. What have you done? She pulled him into a trembling hug. I don't understand. They told me you broke a car window. Are you okay? Do you realize how dangerous that was? Tom opened his mouth to explain, but before he could, Officer Diamond stepped into the room. Please calm down, he said to Tom's mother. Your son didn't do anything wrong. He saved a baby's life, a child who was trapped in a car under the scorching sun. Tom's mother froze, her eyes widening. A baby? She repeated. Diamond nodded and began explaining the situation, detailing how Tom had found the child, acted quickly to save him, and brought him to the clinic. Your son was incredibly brave, he added. It was an emergency, and his actions might have saved that baby's life. Tom's mother closed her eyes briefly, taking it all in. Then, with a heavy sigh, she hugged her son even tighter. Thomas, she said, her voice trembling, you saved a baby? Yeah, Mom, Tom said softly. He might not have made it if I hadn't broken the window. She ran her hand through his hair, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh my God! I was so scared you'd gotten into trouble." At that moment, another police officer entered the room, his face showing slight relief. "We found the baby's parents," he announced. "They're already at the clinic." Diamond nodded. "Good. We'll talk to them and figure out what happened." Tom's mom, still holding her son close, looked at the officer. "Does this mean my son isn't in any trouble?" "Absolutely not," Diamond reassured her. "His actions saved a life." Tom's mom exhaled deeply and sat next to him, gripping his hand tightly. Tom felt her anxiety slowly fading as silence settled over the room. Tom sat up straight. "The baby's parents are here? What did they say?" Elizabeth Blackwell sat down across from him, folding her hands on her lap. "The baby's father arrived at the clinic after the police tracked him down through the car's registration. He was devastated. He said he thought the baby's mother had taken him out of the car when they went to the store." Tom's stomach churned again. "Forgot? How can someone forget their own child?" The doctor sighed deeply. "People underestimate how dangerous distractions, stress, and routine can be. It can lead to catastrophic mistakes." She paused before continuing. "Right now, the police are interviewing both parents to determine whether this was a misunderstanding or something more serious." Before Tom could respond, the door opened again, and Officer Diamond stepped in. His expression was firm but not harsh. "Tom, the baby's parents would like to speak with you. If you're ready, I can arrange it." Tom hesitated. The thought of meeting the people who had put their child in such danger, filling him with both anger and discomfort. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay." Diamond led him down the hallway to a small consultation room. Inside, a man sat with his head in his hands, while a woman stood by the window, hugging herself. The tension in the room was palpable as Tom stepped inside. The man looked up, his red, swollen eyes filled with guilt. "Are you the boy who saved my son?" he asked, his voice shaking. Tom froze, unsure of what to say. The woman turned away from the window, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. I can't even—" Her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. The man stood on unsteady feet. "You gave us a second chance. If it weren't for you—" His words were swallowed by emotion. The anger Tom had been holding back bubbled to the surface. "How could you leave a baby in a car?" he asked sharply, his voice louder than he'd intended. "Do you understand how close it was? Your son almost—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The man flinched, his guilt written all over his face. "I thought my wife had taken him," he murmured. "I swear, I thought—" "You thought wrong," Tom snapped, his voice trembling. The doctor, who had quietly entered the room behind them, stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder. "Tom," she said softly, "I understand your anger, but this family will live with the consequences of this day for the rest of their lives. They made a terrible mistake, but it's not our job to punish them." The room fell into an awkward silence. The man slumped back into his chair, his shoulders sagging. The woman continued to cry softly. Tom looked at them, his emotions tangled in a knot of frustration, pity, and concern for the baby. The doctor turned to the parents. "Your son is stable now," she said gently but firmly. "But this incident will have legal and emotional repercussions. The police and child services will be working with you." The parents nodded, their movements stiff and awkward, gratitude and regret evident in their every glance. As the officer escorted Tom back into the hallway, the man's voice called out behind them. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "You'll never know how much this means to us." Tom didn't respond. He walked down the hallway with heavy steps, drained by the day's events. The adrenaline that had fueled him all morning had long since disappeared, leaving only exhaustion and a dull ache in his chest. Dr. Blackwell caught up with him as they reached the clinic's exit. "Tom," she said warmly, "I know today has been incredibly hard for you, but you need to understand that what you did was an act of courage and compassion. It's important, not just for that baby, but for everyone who saw how you acted today. You showed what it means to do the right thing." Tom looked down at his sneakers, unsure of how to respond. Her words carried a weight that he couldn't fully process in the moment, but deep down, he knew they were true. When he stepped outside with his mom, the setting sun bathed Phoenix in a golden light. Tom took a deep breath of the warm evening air, tinged with the promise of a cool night ahead. He stared at the horizon, the events of the day replaying in his mind. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel a tiny spark of hope. The baby was safe. The parents had a chance to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, Tom had discovered something within himself he hadn't known was there. In the days that followed, life in Phoenix returned to its usual rhythm. But for Tom, everything had changed. At school, his thoughts kept drifting back to the baby he had saved. The image of the child's flushed, fragile face haunted him, but it was alive, and that was what mattered most. Soon, Tom learned that the baby's parents had been fined for endangering their child. The court also placed them on probation, requiring them to take parenting classes and undergo regular social services checks. The news left Tom with mixed feelings. On one hand, he understood the need to protect the baby. On the other, he still felt a lingering anger and sadness that such measures had been necessary in the first place. Despite it all, he couldn't shake the sense of relief that the baby was now safer. He didn't know what the family's future held, but he hoped this incident would push the parents to be more careful and responsible. Word of Tom's actions spread quickly through school and the neighborhood. Classmates whispered about him in the hallways, and neighbors stopped him on the street to praise his bravery. But for Tom, the attention was overwhelming. "I didn't do anything special," he grumbled whenever someone tried to compliment him, yet deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. One day, sitting in the back row during history class, Tom felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. He glanced down and saw a message. It was from Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. "Hi, Tom. I've been thinking a lot about what happened and how you handled it. Would you like to visit the clinic again? I think it might be good for you." Tom stared at the screen, unsure of how to respond. He remembered her kind, steady gaze and calm voice, which had helped him get through that chaotic day. Finally, he typed a short reply. "Okay, when?" When Tom returned to the clinic, not as a hero this time, but as a guest, Dr. Blackwell greeted him at the entrance, her smile as warm as he remembered. "Thank you for coming," she said, guiding him down the now familiar hallway. "I thought you might be interested in seeing a different side of this place, the side most people don't notice." She led him into a supply room filled with medical equipment. Shelves were lined with boxes of bandages, gloves, syringes, and neatly labeled medications. "This is where it all starts," she said, handing him a pair of medical gloves. "Today you can help us get a little organized." Tom hesitated. "But I don't know anything about this," he admitted. Elizabeth smiled. "You don't need to do much. Just be willing to help and try to understand what we're doing here." Tom began unpacking the boxes under the doctor's guidance. While they worked, she told him about the clinic and the people who came there every day. She spoke about the long shifts, difficult cases, and the small victories that made it all worthwhile. "What you did for that little baby reminded me why I chose this profession," she said as she placed a box of gloves on a shelf. "It's easy to forget why you're here when you're drowning in paperwork and protocols, but every life we touch matters." Tom listened, growing more and more respectful of her work. He thought back to that day when fear and desperation had driven him to act. At the time, he hadn't felt brave. He'd simply wanted to help. When they finished organizing the storage room, the doctor invited him to visit one of the children's rooms in the clinic. Inside, a boy of about 5 sat on the examination table, nervously swinging his legs. His mother stood beside him with a worried look on her face. "This is Michael," the doctor said with a kind smile. "He's here for a checkup, but feeling a little nervous. Tom, maybe you could stay with him while I review his chart?" Tom was surprised but nodded. "Of course." Michael looked up at Tom with wide eyes. "Are you a doctor?" Tom laughed. "No, not at all. I'm just here to help." The boy relaxed a little and smiled. "Doctors are scary, but you're not." Tom made a funny face to make Michael laugh and started asking him about his favorite toys and video games. The boy lit up, enthusiastically telling a story about his dog. By the time the doctor returned, Michael no longer seemed scared at all. "You have a gift," she told Tom later as they walked down the hallway. "Building a connection with people. That's something you can't teach." Her words stayed with Tom for a long time. For the first time, he began to wonder if there might be a place for him in the world where he could use this ability to help others. When they returned to the clinic's main hallway, the doctor stopped and looked at Tom with a serious expression. "Have you ever thought about what you want to do in the future?" she asked. The question caught Tom off guard. "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I haven't really thought about it much before." Elizabeth Blackwell smiled. "That's okay, but after what I saw today, I think you have the potential to do something great. It doesn't have to be as a doctor, but you could find a place where you can help people." Her words were both encouraging and intimidating. Tom went home with that conversation replaying in his head. Sitting at the kitchen table with his history textbooks, he realized something had changed. The thought of the future no longer scared him. Instead, it filled him with a sense of purpose. He didn't know how yet, but he wanted to do something meaningful. Soon, Tom returned to the clinic to try volunteering. With Elizabeth Blackwell's approval, he signed up to help on weekends and during school breaks. The first time he entered the clinic wearing a badge that said volunteer, his heart raced. Blackwell greeted him at the entrance with the same warm smile. "Welcome back, Tom. Let's get started." The day was busy. Tom helped sort paperwork, observed the nurses as they prepared equipment for sterilization, and handled small organizational tasks. Sometimes the work felt routine, but the atmosphere and purpose of the place captivated him. After lunch, the doctor approached him in the hallway with a mysterious smile. "There's someone here who wants to see you," she said, leading him to a small room. Tom walked in and froze. There sat the parents of the baby he had saved. In the father's arms was the same child, now healthy, alive, and with sparkling eyes and a mischievous smile. The father spoke first, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you. You saved our son's life. Because of you, we still have our family." The mother stepped forward, holding a small box wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said softly. "It's not much, but we wanted you to have something to remind you of what you did." Tom took the gift, his cheeks turning pink. "You don't need to thank me," he murmured. "I just did what anyone would have done." Tears filled the mother's eyes. "That's where you're wrong," she said. "Not everyone would have done what you did. You didn't hesitate. You acted when it mattered most." Tom carefully unwrapped the box. Inside was a small framed photo of the smiling, healthy baby. Engraved on the frame were the words, "You gave us hope. Thank you." For a moment, Tom simply stared at the photo. Then he looked at the parents and the baby, who was reaching out to him with tiny hands. After they left, Tom sat in a quiet hallway with Elizabeth Blackwell, still holding the frame. "I didn't expect that," he admitted, looking at the baby's joyful face in the photo. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's moments like these that remind us why we do what we do," she said. "It's not always easy, and it doesn't always bring instant rewards. But when you see the difference you've made in someone's life, it all falls into place." Tom nodded, feeling her words resonate deeply. He thought back to the day he found the baby, and his heart swelled with a sense of purpose. From that day on, Tom continued volunteering at the clinic. Each week, he eagerly anticipated his shifts. Every day at the clinic brought new lessons, and with each experience, he grew more certain of how important even the smallest contributions could be. The nurses and doctors began to notice not only Tom's hard work, but also his special way of connecting with patients. He had a talent for making even the most frightened children smile. Over time, Tom's thoughts of becoming a doctor grew from a faint spark into a bright, burning passion. "You're definitely changing," Blackwell remarked during one of their conversations. "You've become more focused." Tom paused to reflect on her words before finally admitting, "I think I've finally figured out what I want to do. I want to help people. Maybe even become a doctor, like you." Elizabeth's smile was full of pride, but she added a gentle warning. "That's a wonderful goal, but you need to understand, it won't be easy. Medical school is years of hard work, and being a doctor isn't always simple. It's a commitment that changes your whole life." Tom nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "I know, but after everything that's happened, I can't imagine doing anything else." His words touched Blackwell deeply. She decided to support him by recommending him for a local mentorship program for high school students interested in medicine. That program marked the start of a new chapter in Tom's life. He shadowed doctors during their rounds, observed their work, and learned how every detail mattered in patient care. These experiences only solidified his desire to pursue this path. Still, Tom knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Getting into medical school seemed like an impossible mountain to climb. He would need to study tirelessly, address financial challenges, and overcome his own doubts. One evening, while flipping through a college guidebook, his eyes landed on the section about pre-medical programs. The thought of years of rigorous study and challenges loomed over him, but he remembered the face of the baby he had saved and the grateful smiles of the parents. Tom closed the book, feeling a growing resolve inside him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: this was the path he was meant to follow. Thank you for listening to the story. Let us know what you think in the comments. Subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep creating new stories every day. Don't miss the next amazing story coming soon to your screen. We're so grateful to have you with us. See you next time.